All right, welcome everyone to the Week 3 Fantasy Cruncher podcast. I'm Jared here with Brad and Zach, and in case you missed it, we had some pretty exciting announcement earlier this morning, and some of our insiders would have got it last night. That we've actually joined forces from moving from Moxyball over to Fantasy Cruncher, and we're pretty pumped about it. It's going to be a great new move for everyone on the team here, but the entire business, frankly, moving forward as we bring content into the great software and tools that Fantasy Crunchers had in place for a few years now, and we're pumped to be part of the team. So for more information on that, head over to moxyball.com and you can read more about that or shoot us an email if you have any questions. But I know I speak on behalf of all of us when I say we're pretty pumped about it. So I'm sure that's not why you're tuning into this podcast, though. We just wanted to get that kind of out of the way. And we'll dive right into Week 3. So, Brad, why don't I throw it over to you and kind of ask, hey, what are some of the thoughts that you have kind of coming out of Week 2 of the NFL DFS season? Anything that struck you or you wanted to mention as a key learning or takeaway?
Yeah, don't pick injured players. As I talked about last week, I was pretty heavily invested in Danny Woodhead. So seeing him go down was it derailed my Week 2 goals. But no, I mean, as far as what I took away from the week, it's really, for me, I would say don't forget how dynamic that the Cam Newton can be. As somebody who, in my cash game lineup so far, and Zach and I were talking about this a little earlier, but I haven't got a touchdown pass from any of my core cash game quarterbacks so far this year, between Dak Prescott in Week 1 and Eli Manning last week. I was going back and forth all week between Newton and Eli, and ended up going with the latter. And just seeing what Cam can do, seeing him in action last week, he really does bring a very high floor, especially when he has a nice matchup. So it was one thing that kind of refreshed or reset in my mind that I took away from Week 2.
Fair enough. I can't argue that Woodhead screwed me as well, and I know you know that because we talked about that on the weekend. But Zach, what about you? Anything else you wanted to add to that?
Just trust your process. Just because the results might not have worked that week, if your process is there, it's going to work 9 times out of 10. Even though I didn't have the great week because I had Eli Manning and AJ Green, even with knowing the results, I probably would have still made those plays because they were the correct plays. Just because they don't work out one week doesn't mean you should just totally diss your process. My process is correct. Just because it didn't work out, I'm not too concerned about it. So just trust your process, even if the results aren't there after a week.
Couldn't agree more with that. And just for me, I know I mentioned this in the starting 5 this morning. If you haven't checked it out, give it a read for Week 3. But after Thursday Night Football, it is very, very clear the Bills are awful, especially that defense. And if you don't start at least 1 or 2 players on the opposing team, especially when they have talent, definitely give that a second thought, because thinking about Week 3, Arizona is in an amazing spot to see some huge numbers from some of their offensive players. Mainly, we'll get into exactly who I'm talking about, but man, oh man, are they just ripe for the picking from an offensive standpoint? So put that in your back pocket, because I think that'll come in handy in a big way in Week 3. Let's move on to a section that we've got a lot of great feedback on from our viewers and listeners. Just favorite plays by position. Fairly simple, but gives us an opportunity to talk about plays that each of us like. Zach, why don't you start us off with a quarterback or two that are high on your list for the Week 3 slate?
Phillip Rivers. Plain and simple, the Chargers throw the ball all the time. I know Melvin Gordon's emerged a little bit this year, and they're decimated with injuries, but they're going to put the ball in Phillip Rivers' hands time and time again in what should be a shootout versus the Colts. And the Colts don't have a great defense. They're still unlike their fifth-string cornerbacks that's starting. They're injured in the secondary. I'm all on Phillip Rivers. He's very affordable on almost every site you can get on. I think you can spend down the Rivers, spend up at other positions, and I just love Rivers this week. I'm all in on him, and hopefully I get a touchdown.
This could be the week for a touchdown out of the quarterback position. Brad, what are your thoughts?
For me, there's a lot of value out there this week, so I'm not necessarily looking to go cheap at quarterback. Somebody that stands out to me right off the top, and it shouldn't really be a surprise, is Andrew Luck.
Mm-hmm.
He's expensive, but we all saw what he did in week one. I'm willing to give him a mulligan last week. I mean, not many people moved the ball against the Denver defense, especially at Mile High. But in that same matchup against the Chargers, I do think Rivers will have a good game as well. But I do think Andrew Luck will be very productive on Sunday. Looking a little cheaper, especially in GPPs, I'm kind of intrigued by Kirk Cousins going up against the Giants. I know the Giants did a respectable job, maybe even a good job against Drew Brees last week, but we all know the Saints don't necessarily travel all that well. Cousins has been off the first couple weeks. That said, I really do like the matchup for him. And we all saw what he could do last year, where really for no rhyme or reason in certain given weeks, he just lighted up. So he's more of a GPP play for me, but checking in at 7,200 on FanDuel, I think there's a lot of upside with that play. So I like him in what I do feel will be a high-scoring game between the Redskins and the Giants.
Yeah, I like all the guys that you guys have all mentioned. The two others that I'll add. Number one, I actually think that this is an intriguing spot to play Aaron Rodgers. His price is down a little bit in the matchup against the Lions is usually a good one. So nice upside there and at a good price. And then I just have a tough time seeing how I don't start Carson Palmer. Sometimes we talk about trusting your gut and exploiting great matchups. Doesn't get much better than Arizona against Buffalo this week, in my opinion. They just can't defend anything right now, and I think that a full on exposure situation to Arizona will be very, very, very fruitful. Brad, throw it back to you. What about running backs? Who you got?
Somebody that I think on first glance a lot of people will think is a pretty chalky play, but that I feel probably will be lower owned than he should, is Melvin Gordon. I'm not a big fan of his as a runner, but it's hard to argue with what he's done so far out of the gate.
Do you think he'll be higher owned on one side over another, or just kind of across the board?
A little bit higher, I think, on FanDuel. Just he's not much of a threat out of the backfield when it comes to catching the ball. That said, I think he's a good play on both sides. I think some might shy away for fear of point chasing, thinking that the best is behind him. But I really like that game to be a high-scoring affair, and I would be surprised if he doesn't manage to find the end zone. So he's going to get more touches now that Woodhead's gone. San Diego like to find ways to get him the ball, and while I don't envision him being used in the exact same fashion, it wouldn't surprise me to see him north of 20 carries again. So with a price of 7,100 on FanDuel and 5,800 on DraftKings, I like him a lot as a core play. That you're not going to get him at low ownership, but I do think it'll be lower than it should be, especially in cash games. One other guy that I do like on the high end is David Johnson. You mentioned the Bills' struggles. And for whatever reason, people don't seem to enjoy spending up at the running back position. But he checks in at 8,400 on FanDuel this week, and he's a dual threat. He can run the ball, he can catch it out of the backfield, and they use him in all scenarios. So I really, really, really like him. And without being necessarily in love with any of the high-priced receivers, I think you can easily fit him into your lineups this week.
Yep, I agree. Zach, what about you?
Well, I'll get into why you shouldn't play David Johnson later on. But I agree with Melvin Gordon. I think he's a must-start for me, especially in cash games. The Colts have the worst run defense right now in the NFL. They're giving up the most points per game to running backs. They're third in yards and rushing yards allowed. So Melvin Gordon has to be on your team. If I'm spending up, it's for D'Angelo Williams against Philly. But another name I like, and I'm going to go on each site. On FanDuel, I love Isaiah Crowell. Even though we're going to all say the Dolphins are the defense to pick later on, he's been running the ball really well. He's getting the bulk of the carries, and the Dolphins have one of the worst run defenses. And on DraftKings, especially if Thomas Rawls is ruled out like he should be, Christian Michael, I'm a truther of his. I think he has more talent than 95% of the running backs. He should get all the carries in a game against the 49ers. And DraftKings, he's the first player I put in my lineups.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I'm glad you covered it. I actually am quite intrigued by Johnson as well. Glad you mentioned D'Angelo because he's very high on my radar. A couple other names. I know I mentioned Justin Forsett last week. He wasn't a barn burner by any means, but on DraftKings he's an absolute steal. He's under $4,000 this week, and as a guy that can catch the ball and put up basically a floor of 6 or 7 points with upside for obviously a lot more. He's very serviceable at that price, especially given the flexibility that he provides. I still like Devonta Freeman. I mean, I've talked about him for a couple weeks now. He actually had a pretty good game last week, and it should be even better. I think this one coming up against the Saints, and frankly, his price is really affordable. He's under $6,000 on DraftKings and is pretty good on FanDuel as well. And then this is going to be really a dependency on the situation with Adrian Peterson as the week rolls out. But I think Jerick McKinnon and Matt Asiata are both in consideration if their touches are a little bit more predictable. Their price points are both phenomenal on just about on all sides across the board. And despite it being maybe not the most attractive or lucrative matchup, I mean, if you're looking at volume, especially in a GPP context, you never know what can happen on any given play. I mean, I wouldn't have predicted that Isaiah Crowell would have a massive day like he did yesterday and get the majority of his points on one carry, but anything can happen in football like that. And with the explosiveness of a guy like McKinnon, you just never know. So value-wise, I'm keeping a close eye on that. I know I spoke about on the starting five, but those guys that I've all mentioned are intriguing to me. Zach, throw it back over to you for receivers. Who's on your list?
Well, first of all, Stefon Diggs, he's become a superstar right before our eyes, and he's still dirt cheap. He's only $6,400 on FanDuel and $5,100 on DraftKings. And the Panthers don't really have anybody who can cover him now that Josh Norman's out. And Shane Bradford can actually get him the ball. Stefon Diggs, first person in your lineups for cash games at his price. Some other people I'm looking at, Travis Benjamin, of course, with my San Diego stack. He's become the go-to wide receiver for them. I know me and Brad talked about this earlier, but Jarvis Landry, he's a target machine. He always is a great PPR play. So I like him. And Kelvin Benjamin, he's probably been the best wide receiver this season. So I think the mid-range tier is where I'm spending at, and those are the 4 or 5 guys that are really on my radar.
Yeah, you're going to make this an easy one for me because I think you and I pretty much have the same list this week. What about you, Brad?
A couple guys not mentioned. Jordan Matthews. We've seen Carson Wentz really look his way a lot so far this year. I know he's sitting at 23 targets through 2 weeks. Mm-hmm. In what should be a fairly high-scoring game with Pittsburgh. I like him to continue to see a lot of targets, and he'll likely hit value. He might fly under the radar a little bit too.
Yeah, price on him is actually still very reasonable. This might be the last time you can get him at a pretty sizable discount. Yeah,
you'll see a big jump, especially on FanDuel next week because
I agree.
He was locked in because the Monday night game. The one guy that I haven't or I don't anticipate will be all that highly owned is Allen Robinson. Mm-hmm. He's had a very quiet start to the year, to put it lightly. Jason Vera did a good job on him this past weekend, but he saw 15 targets in week 1, and sure, he only hauled in 6. But at some point that's going to change. And I think that you could get him at pretty low ownership and what really is a very attractive matchup. I know the Ravens have done a pretty good job through 2 weeks, but let's be honest, they're facing the Buffalo Bills and Cleveland Browns passing games, not the most formidable attacks. So those are 2 guys that are on my radar. The one guy too, don't rule out Antonio Brown. I might be stating the obvious here, but there's a ton of value out there this week. And even though he only caught 4 balls for 39 yards, he did still have 11 targets, and he's going to continue to see double-digit looks from Big Ben. So that's kind of my quick summary on the wide receiver position this week.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned those guys as well, because they're on my radar. I'll just quickly mention Fitzgerald is, again, definitely a guy to pair with Palmer. I know I've mentioned that a few times, how high I am on Arizona this week. You could also make an argument for Michael Floyd and frankly, either of the Browns as GPP pivots. And then the other guy that I'll mention as well is Mike Evans. Love the target hogs. The dude is just throwing the ball all the time. And frankly, that's what I really like to invest in, especially for high floor situations, because targets are opportunities, to speak proper English, and that's what I like to make sure that I put my money behind. One actually thing just to mention on your Allen Robinson pick, and I'm glad you did bring him up, is I actually read an article this morning. I think it may have been on ESPN around how officials on the Jaguars believe that their week 1 opponent got away with about 10 to 15 defensive penalties that weren't called. And I think about half of those were expected to have been on Allen Robinson. So it's not that he was looking for excuses, but when you're looking for indicators of potential success, and if you watch the game tape, I saw some of the highlights and I can't disagree with it. It's definitely a situation where you're going to get him at a bit of a decreased price, decreased ownership, and frankly, he's got all the talent he had last year, and I love that play. Especially for tournaments this week.
That can happen. I remember middle of the year last year, I was pretty heavily invested with a Rodgers and Devontae Adams stack.
Oh, I remember we were watching that game together
when they were playing in Detroit, and they were mugging him the entire game, and for whatever reason, just absolutely nothing was being called. So
was that his 15 target or 20 target game or something for Adams? It was something outrageous.
Yeah, he Rodgers was looking his way. There wasn't really anybody else out there. I think Cobb was either left the game hurt or was hobbling around at half speed for the entire day. And yeah, Rodgers just kept looking to Adams, and he was getting mugged the entire afternoon. So yeah, that can happen.
Yeah, for sure. And I think there's some good value there. Just while we're talking receiving threats, what are your thoughts on tight ends this week, Brad?
You know what? There's 2 guys that really intrigue me. I'll start with the cheap guy, Dennis Pitta. Mm-hmm. He checks in at $5K on FanDuel, and I find it difficult to believe that he's not going to hit value. That said, we've talked an awful lot about fairly cheap plays. You got to spend up somewhere. And the one guy who's been pretty quiet as far as production goes, but that I do like to have a monster game this week, is Jordan Reed. He's been pretty quiet so far, but he is seeing the looks from Kirk Cousins. And the Giants really do struggle defending over the middle of the field. So it would not shock me to see him north of 25 points this week. I like him a lot.
That's good. And it would be a nice pairing for you with Cousins too.
Yeah.
Especially in tournaments. Zach, thoughts? Tight ends?
I'm going to go back to Delaney Walker. I know I talk him up every time we're on this podcast, but to me, he's a tight end that you want to own. He gets the Raiders, and I'm just going to throw the stat out on the Raiders. They have allowed an opposing tight end to record either 70-plus yards or a touchdown in 12 of the last 17 games. Now you put Delaney Walker, who in my opinion is one of the top 3 tight ends in the league, and what he did last week, 6 targets, 6 receptions, 83 yards, and a touchdown against the Raiders, and he had a high scoring tight end this week. There's no doubt in my mind.
All right. That's pretty hard to argue with. Some pretty compelling stuff there. I'll just throw out one more name that I think is intriguing. Frankly, again, it's Jesse James on Pittsburgh. Super cheap on FanDuel in particular. I mean, he's very cheap on DraftKings as well, but there are quite a few guys at that price point that you can consider. But I just think that if the role he's kind of carving out there in a pass in a high end offense. I mean, if you're not going to go with D'Angelo, if you're not going to go Brown, or even if you do go with those guys, never a bad idea to have a bit of exposure to a guy that's starting to emerge as a bit of a receiving threat for the Steelers. Okay, so let's kind of cap it there in terms of the skill position players. Anybody have any thoughts to defense and or kickers for those of us that play on FanDuel as well as to who's on your radar this week? Maybe just one or two guys. I know we will go a lot deeper into this in our premium cheat sheet, but anything to add at this point in time on a Tuesday night?
Are we really talking about kickers?
It can be important. I mean, it's not necessarily the be all to end all, but usually you do see some good production out of them, especially for GPPs, right? You just never know.
Yeah, to me, flip a coin and see where things line up. Find a guy with a high total, maybe a team that struggles to punch the ball into the end zone. Prime target for me most weeks is Justin Tucker. Baltimore in general does struggle to score. Forsett can't punch it into the end zone, and Joe Flacco's Joe Flacco. So they can move the ball a little bit, but quite often, there's a reason why he's pretty much universally ranked the number one kicker each and every year. Yep. Until something changes with that offense, he's an attractive play if you don't go with a min-price kicker.
Fair enough.
All right, so I'm going to disagree with Brad here. Kicker is probably one of the most important positions if you're playing on FanDuel, because if you botch the kicker spot, you're going to botch your whole lineups. You have to get at least 10 points from your kicker, otherwise you're not going to be successful.
I'm not saying to throw it away. Like don't go out and pick the Cleveland Browns kicker. I'm not saying do that. I'm just saying good luck figuring out whether your guy's going to get 8 FanDuel points or 19 or 18 like Graham Gano did last week. I mean, it's tough.
There's actually science to it. I'm not going to go over the science on this podcast because it'll take us about another hour. But I'll just go over the basics. Good weather on the dome, high scoring like Brad said, and a team that can't score very well like Brad said. So you want to look at like a Brandon McManus over Denver. They can put the ball down the field, but they have trouble punching and getting in. Mason Crosby, he's going to get a lot of looks in Detroit. Players like that. Or you can just go to San Diego kicker or the Colts kicker, Adam Vinatieri, John Lambeau. Both of them are going to have great games, but don't just punt the kicker. Actually do a little bit of research. I'm not saying you have to do a lot of research. Do a little bit of research and help yourself separate from the rest of the pack, especially in GPPs.
But I will say this, if you play on DraftKings, spend no time on kickers because there's literally no value in doing so. So just as a one caveat, make sure that you know your format. Awesome. In terms of defense, I know, Brad, I think you mentioned it earlier with Miami, but are they the chalk defense this week against the third string quarterback from Cleveland? Like, what do you guys think? I mean, is there another option to consider?
Yes. Sure. There's other options to consider. For one, if you do want to spend up, to me, I like Seattle. Anytime Seattle's playing at home, and on a week where there is a ton of value out there, it might not be a bad idea, especially if you think that Miami can't stop the run, which as a Dolphins fan, I can't necessarily argue with. Seattle's a viable option. There's a few out there, and I don't know how high owned Miami necessarily will be, to be perfectly honest. We'll see. I'd guess in and around 20%, but you're not going to see anything outlandish, I don't think.
Yeah, it's probably the highest that they'll be owned all year, though, on both sites. Zach, I know you were chomping at the bit to say something there. Did you want to jump in with thought?
Yeah, I like the Dolphins this week, but not on. For those of y'all who play on Yahoo, they're easy fade because they're the most expensive. But a defense I really like this week that are the same price as them on FanDuel and a lot cheaper is the Cowboys, because Cutler is not going to play, or if he plays, he's not going to be at 100%. So they don't really have a great backup in Chicago. I know they have like a decent backup, and Jeremy Langford is not a good running back. He only gets carries because they don't have anybody else. The Cowboys have actually been a pretty decent defense this season. The Cowboys at only 2,500 on DraftKings. If you want to spend up that a lot of positions, they are a team I really like.
I think Brian Hoyer is better than Jay Cutler. I think Jay Cutler's terrible. That's
He had one good year in a pass-happy offense. Yeah. I'm not going to – I mean, but –
I've got so many great topics for us to have on our Week 4 podcast. This is great. We're getting fired up here. This is awesome. But we'll have a Jay Cutler debate another time, because we got to get some good memes going for that one. Yeah, no, it's interesting. I mean, I think there's a few different ways you can go there. I'm actually kind of intrigued by Dallas, because just from an ownership perspective, they're probably not going to be really on the radar for many guys. So I kind of like that. Let's kind of look across the river to chalk plays that you may want to stay away from. I think a couple of us have kind of mentioned a few that we like, especially some of the on the higher end / middle as well. But is there anyone that you think is going to be popular that you're a little bit weary on, or that you guys think that we should avoid? And Zach, I guess let's ask you that question first, since you ended off the last little mini segment there.
I'm going to start with David Johnson. Okay, the reason why I'm starting with David Johnson is now that Chris Johnson is healthy, I don't think he's going to get as many touches as he's been getting. He was actually out-touched by Chris Johnson last week, and if he would have not had like that 70, 80-yard catch, he would have not done anything. In GPPs, yes, David Johnson, he has more upside than anybody else. He can break one anytime. But in cash games, I don't see how you can spend up for him with his touches when you can get somebody like D'Angelo Williams, who you know is going to get 25, 30 touches at around the same price. So David Johnson, to me, is the one I'm going to go away from.
Yeah, that's kind of fair. But I think just to also give him the credit, or just kind of to be a little bit more fair to him, I think it was probably more a bit of a game flow issue, right? That probably took his touches down, because they were up by like 30 some odd points, and they didn't really want him to keep on touching the ball. But I did read something about it, admitting that he did have a few miscues, which may have kind of led him to be in a bit of a short-term doghouse overnight stay kind of situation. But I'll be really surprised if Chris Johnson matches him in touches in games that aren't blowouts, personally. But
you just said, well, hold on your thinking, you've been saying the Cardinals are going to blow out the Bills all week, all podcast, right?
Absolutely. I'm not necessarily saying I'm going all in on David Johnson. I did mention Carson Palmer and Larry Fitzgerald, first of all, but I don't think it's fair to say that Chris Johnson is going to be there touch for touch for him, and his job is in any kind of jeopardy right now. I mean, I could eat my words. It's the NFL. You never know. But I think game flow had a lot to do with the Chris Johnson sighting this past weekend.
I'm not saying it's in jeopardy, but the Cardinals, they do like to spread out their running backs. And I think they would rather their players be healthier for the playoffs. That's just how Bruce Arians works.
Yeah.
So I think in the early going, you're playing with fire with David Johnson in cash games. In GPPs, I'm all for him. But in cash games, I think you're playing with fire a little bit.
Yeah, no, fair enough. I just wanted to make sure we're on the same page with why we saw a lot of CJ2K on Sunday. Brad, what about you? Any kind of chalky plays that you're nervous about? I know you've kind of mentioned a little bit about Melvin Gordon, who I think is going to be very chalky, but anyone else?
That I'm worried about, to be honest, not really. I think for the most part, we've seen the chalk underperform so far through the first 2 weeks. And just to kind of put a different spin on I guess, this segment of the podcast, I think this is a week where you're going to see the chalk have a very strong week. So for me, I don't envision myself playing a whole lot of GPPs this week. I just think most of the high-owned guys are going to have very strong weeks.
Yeah, that's fair. I actually feel very similar to that. if you do play some GPPs, I think fitting a guy like Melvin Gordon, I know that you said you think his ownership is going to be a little bit lower. I actually expect it to be pretty high because the matchup's pretty good. The price point is incredibly accessible on both sites. And frankly, I think a lot of people have a tendency to chase. And so I feel like if you do want to fade him in GPP just in case he does struggle to have a huge game, I think that could be an interesting approach. The one guy I'm a little nervous about, quite honestly, is Julio Jones. And we haven't talked about him yet and anything that we've discussed for week 3 just yet. But and I would say I'm not really sure if he's complete chalk, but that game is going to be prime for targeting. I think the over-under is probably 52, 53 or something like that right now at the time of us recording it. It wouldn't shock me if it goes up over the course of the week. But we know he's better at home, and honestly, his targets have been a lot lower year to date than what it was last year, and I don't know if that's really an issue with kind of, or not necessarily an issue, but a choice in play calling, or if it's 100% game flow oriented. I think it's a bit too early to make that conclusion, but seeing as his targets have been fairly low, not even really close to double digits in either of the 2 games, I think that there might be something there that could potentially be a bit of a bust if people do invest in him heavily, because there could be just something going on in terms of how they're coaching that game that might lead them to be a bit of a lower scoring play. But that being said, he could end up being the top scoring wide receiver on the board, as there are lots of indications that would suggest that exposure to that game is key. So take the good with the bad. That's just a thought in terms of attacking that strategically.
I think isn't that game on Monday night though?
Yeah, that game's going to be a track meet, but
who's going to play that slate now with all the main slates? That's my only thing about the game is all the main slates only have Sunday now, so it's kind of a pointless game.
Well, there's still a lot of contests that people are going to be entering. I mean, they're especially on the cheaper side for GPPs and whatnot. So there should be some attention on that, and ownership, especially in those games, tends to be kind of high, depending on the slates you play in, or it can be. It's totally slate dependent. I'll take that back, but I don't know. He could, like I said, he could be great. He could be, or he could be someone to avoid on the Sunday, Monday, or the primetime slates. I don't know. That's just food for thought strategically. Games. So I know we'll get to that kind of contest selection piece in a second. I know that we're hot on that, but are there any kind of games that you guys are targeting from a stack situation? I mean, it can work from time to time, particularly in GPPs if you think both teams are going to go crazy. But is there something that maybe isn't like right on the top of the board, like with the Falcons game we just talked about, that you guys think is worth targeting in that context?
I like San Diego Indy. I think that game's going to be a shootout. I mean, Zach's really high on Phil Rivers. I really like Andrew Luck. I would not be surprised if that ends up being the highest scoring game this week. And as a bit of a dark horse, it wouldn't shock me to see the Giants in Washington end up in a little bit of a shootout. I know sometimes NFC East games can be a little slow paced, but generally we thank the Cowboys for that. That said, I think Cousins and Eli are both in good spots this week. The problem will be trying to figure out who's going to get the bulk of the action. Do you stick with the core plays of Jordan Reed and Odell Beckham Jr. on the other side, or do you pivot off that for maybe somebody that's going to be really low owned?
Yeah. No, those are definitely some interesting things to consider. Zach, do you have any games that Brad hasn't mentioned that you're intrigued by?
A game I'm intrigued by because I think it's going to be high scoring, but it shouldn't be high scoring. All signs point it not to be high scoring, but I just have a feeling is the Rams and Buccaneers. For some reason, I just think that game's going to be a shootout when it really shouldn't be, because both offenses, I mean, the Buccaneers have a good offense, but the Rams have a great defense, but a bad offense. So that game it intrigues me because I think the Rams offense can actually do something this week. And I just like the Buccaneers as a whole, so I don't know.
Are you targeting Gurley and Evans in that one, or are you looking elsewhere?
I'm targeting Gurley. I wrote about him in a running back cheat sheet. I think he's in for a big bounce back week. But the player I'm targeting on the Bucs is actually because Martin looks to be out. So as a dump off back, I really like Sims as like a cheap play. I like both running backs in that game actually, just as under the own contrarian plays. I think are both going to have huge games.
Yeah, those are definitely not on my like top of the radar for me. So I'm glad you mentioned it. Definitely have to do a little bit more digging there. The one other one that you guys haven't mentioned is Detroit and Green Bay. This is always a good matchup there, and like I said, I think that we could see some players that have been a little bit short in terms of their performance so far, like a Golden Tate, Randall Cobb, Aaron Rodgers have some good games. So it would not shock me if that turns out to be one of the top scoring games on both sides, and plenty of DFS production to go around there. Let's move quickly over to a bit of a strategic close. That's a topic I know that we were talking about today as a team over the course of the day. But contest selection, especially with the way that some of the rakes have moved on some of the major GPPs in particular. Zach and Brad, I know you guys both had some key points that you wanted to touch on. Just a little bit of guidance back to our listeners and viewers as to what's been going on in the industry and what to keep an eye out for some that might be a little bit more even of a casual or lineup construction focused fan that might be missing some of the other kind of news related stories.
Yeah, so I mean, Zach mentioned first things first, FanDuel has removed the Monday night game from the main slate. So keep that in mind, obviously, when you go to lock in a Falcon or a New Orleans option and they're not there. FanDuel isn't broken. They did remove that game from the slate. So
well, that's debatable, but that's a whole other story.
It's a different setup, and I mean we saw DraftKings do that right out of the gate this year. I'm not really a fan of it because I found for whatever reason the Monday night guys seem to be lower owned than what I anticipated. Maybe I was just consistently always higher on them, not by default or not through any conscious choice. But the more games, the better for me. So I was disappointed to see that move. First and foremost, sure there are slates where that game is available, such as the Thursday lock contest, for instance. They still do have a Sunday Monday option, as well as everybody's favorite primetime slates, which personally I'm not a big fan of. But that was the real big takeaway for me. And I mean, I don't want to steal this segment myself, so maybe I'll toss it over to Zach now.
One thing I want to talk about is double ups and paying attention to the rake. I had a conversation with one of my friends who was talking about how we basically almost had the same lineup. We were a little play off here and there, but he was actually scoring more points than me, and he wasn't cashing. But I was cashing in all my cash games, and I told him it's because you're playing the mass entry double ups where the rake is 15 to 18%, so it's almost like a GPP, and people are entering 50, 60, 70 plus lineups to those, so it's GPP. So be careful what double ups you're playing. I'm not a fan of a multi-entry double up or one that's like the big double ups that FanDuel offers because the rake's higher and you're having people entering hundreds and hundreds of lineups. You're better off playing a 50-50 than a double up personally, or just putting your money into a GPP because they're paying out as GPPs almost the same percentage-wise with the same rake. So be careful about the rake. Be conscious of the rake of your contest. Know what the rake is before you put in that contest, especially in cash games.
Yeah, and it's super valuable. And I mean, if you don't have a plugin or a key eye for understanding how the rake's calculated, just grab a calculator or open up Excel or something and do the math yourself. It can really be beneficial over the long run. And the other thing, just quickly to touch on in double up, Zach, I mean, and you guys probably see this too, but every time, I mean, I've been kind of dabbling on both just to kind of see how the lines are moving this week, this year so far through the 2 weeks. But I'm definitely noticing, 5 to 10% higher point totals, frankly, to get into the cash and from GPP, from double ups to 50-50s, with 50-50s being on the lower end. Sure, you get a slightly lower payout, but the rake is hasn't moved, to your point, in terms of what kind of changes we've seen made. And frankly, you can almost always get into the single entry context with relative ease, and they have them at multiple different price breaks on both sites. So based on the smaller differences in terms of percentage payout, and the fact that you can get more value out of your points just simply because they pay out, they tend to kind of cash at a lower overall level, I feel like I'm right there with you in terms of 50-50s being the cash game method of choice over a double up. I mean, there's always going to be a time and place for the triple ups, the quadruple ups, et cetera, which definitely are a lot more to be treated like GPPs in terms of the multipliers. But I'm glad that we're talking about this, because I think it's something that's really, really, really important that could get overlooked if we didn't give it its due. Brad, you look kind of like you want to say something before we shut her down. So I'm not sure if I'm reading that as an anticipation sign down in the bottom corner, or if you're just very excited about some of the stuff we've talked about.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think game selection is largely overlooked by many. I mean, a lot of what I say here is going to be pretty straightforward, but to me, it's key to know what your strengths and weaknesses are as a player, to know what type of games you excel in. If you're not tracking the data for how you perform in 50-50s, double ups, triple ups, GPPs, I recommend you start. And there are a lot of good tools out there to do so. But know what your goals are, and know the type of games that you excel for before you sit down to do your lineups. And know the ins and outs, know what the rake is. It sounds pretty straightforward, but I think it's often overlooked. What are your goals? What are you trying to achieve, and how can you put yourself in the best position to reach those goals?
Very well said. All right. I think I speak on behalf of all of us when I say enjoy week 3 coming up, starting on Thursday night. Lots of great contests out there on frankly all sites to participate in. And again, if you have any questions about the news about Moxyball merging with Fantasy Cruncher, check us out online on Moxyball.com in particular. There's a banner at the top with all the details, and feel free to get in touch with us if you have any kind of key custom questions that you need addressed. But thanks again for all those that have tuned in and that are going to listen throughout the week, and best of luck in week 3, everyone.